All right, hello everyone. God bless. Hope everybody's doing okay. Had a few days off in a row, and I've already been fishing 2 different times. Haven't had much luck. Now, I'll be honest with you, this is in the middle of winter time, so water temperature everywhere I've been so far is about 43 degrees to 44, and just a hard time of year to catch fish. But it came to mind, one of the little videos that I've been wanting to do for a little while is just a talk about jigs. Now, a lot of you, you're going to watch most of the videos and you're going to see me using a crankbait a lot. And you'll think, well, jigs, it doesn't use, looks like he uses jigs very much. Actually though, I used to use jigs a lot. Years ago, I had an older gentleman that kind of taught me and talked to me about jigs. I'd never really had a whole lot of experience with them, but he mentioned to me, and he used to fish bass tournaments quite a bit. He actually had a plaque that he showed me later on. It was Angler of the Year that he had. I'm not talking about Bassmasters or anything. It was just a local tournament that he was fishing, but it was a pretty good sized group. Anyway, he's the one that pretty much taught me and showed me how to use jigs and gave me some advice here or there. And over the years, I kind of developed and made that kind of my own. I've kind of always been the person to experiment a little bit, but I've also been one that, I listen and do things. Started to just look deeper into jigs, because it's like we all hear that in most of the videos that I see online, most everybody talks about jigs and bass jigs specific, but everybody usually talks about jigs. Okay, talk about how it produces bigger fish, talk about it as you're not going to get as many bites, but they just always seem to produce a bigger fish. A lot of people talk about, well, the best thing you can do is just take a jig out and just try with it. Well, I'm going to tell you that there is so much to talk about jigs that it is actually overwhelming. Now, I'm going to say also that us as men probably overthink it a little too much, but that's part of what makes it fun, isn't it? It's something that we can take out and use and experiment, and we all have our strengths. We all have baits that are produced for us. We all have different things. You have those guys that's all they want to throw is just a jig. You have guys that all they want to throw is spinner baits. Other people, all they want to throw is crankbaits. Other people, all they want to do is throw, and they all talk about how it's the best lure ever. When the truth be told, a lot of times it's their favorite, whether they realize it or not, because they use it the most. So for the last little bit, I've started looking at all kinds of different baits as tools. If you go over to a nail, you wouldn't pull out a screwdriver to try to drive it. You would pick up a hammer. If you saw a screw with a Phillips head, you wouldn't pick up a flathead screwdriver. So you would go get a flathead screwdriver for a flathead screw. You would get a Phillips for Phillips screw, and you would get a hammer for a nail. And you sit there and you think, well, that's neat, but that's kind of common sense. Well, I'm going to tell you that jigs are the same way. Jigs are a tool that, could you throw them all the time every day? Yes. Are you going to get bit on them all the time? No. There are times that they're better tools for the situation. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is 3 different jigs that, even though they all look the same, they're not. And I'm not talking about the styles of the head. I'm not talking about, all I'm going to tell you a little bit about is sizes. Why are we going to talk sizes? The first one we're going to talk about is probably the most popular out of all of them, and it's a 1/2 ounce jig. And I've chosen pretty much the same color, as close as I could come to the same color. And I've also chosen the same trailer. This is a Big Salty chunk by Zoom. Just a regular big salty regular green pumpkin. This is about as standard as you get as far as colors as green pumpkin. About as standard as you get in color for a jig as a black one. Why would I use those two together? Well, believe it or not, they're very natural looking. You would think, well, I just pick up a green pumpkin jig if I'm going to throw a green pumpkin trailer. You can, but I've learned that under any water clarity, and people could argue this all day long, under any water clarity, whether it be clear, muddy, dirty, whatever, on this color right here, you can always catch fish. You can throw a black jig with a green pumpkin trailer and you can catch fish anywhere. We're going to talk about the sizes though. That's what's more important. That's what we're going to talk about today. So a half ounce. A half ounce is probably one of the easiest to throw. Why? Because it's so much easier for even an amateur person that just started. I don't necessarily mean amateur, I mean just somebody that started. I'm not a professional by any means. I would still consider myself amateur because I've only been fishing them for about 20 or so years, so I'm still learning. Okay, but what I mean is somebody who's just starting off fishing a jig. A half ounce is pretty neat. Why? Because it's easy to cast. You can cast it a long ways, you can pitch it easy, you can roll cast it, you can throw it in the wind, you can throw it whether it's not windy, you can do anything, you can fill the bottom real easy with it. It's a bait that for the most part is very easy to use. Okay, it's very easy. Probably one of the best things that a person can do, whether they realize it or not, is to pick up one size jig and stick with it for a while. Why is that? Because you're going to learn the weight. You're going to learn so much more about a jig if you'll stick to one weight, because when you are working it, your hand and your mind will get used to that weight. And a lot of times, believe it or not, your bite on a jig is when that bait's going down. A lot of times what a bass will do is that bait is falling, dropped it there, while a bait is falling through the water. Okay, a bass is going to come up sometimes and it's going to sit there and absorb it, suck it right into their mouth and swim with it, and the only thing you feel is no weight, where you used to feel the weight of a half ounce. That's why I say a half ounce is probably the easiest one to throw, because of the weight, because you can tell the difference of when it's falling and when it's not falling, especially with this type of trailer. Now if you use trailers that have the little action and kick, it's a little bit different. Why does that become important? Because believe it or not, with a jig, a lot of times that's what's going to happen to you. You're not always going to get like you do with a worm, to where you get that little tick and all of a sudden you get a bite. Sometimes all you feel is it's no longer heavy, or it's a mushy type of heavy. What I mean is, if you'll grab your jig or have your buddy grab your jig on your rod, and all of a sudden you feel the weight of the bait, and now all of a sudden, instead of feeling just the weight of the jig, you start to feel a constant pressure, which would make that rod tip just barely bend. You can tell that something's on the end of it. So a half ounce jig becomes easier to tell. Now, when is a half ounce jig good? Honestly, it's good any time of the year. But you will become more successful over time if, instead of just always fishing a half ounce jig, if you use a jig in different sizes. What do I mean by that? Well, a half ounce jig is very good to start out with, but if you're always fishing somewhere that, say, it's got 5 or 6 foot deep, you need to go to one that's a little bit heavier. Why would you do that? Well, if you're fishing 5 foot of water, would you use a crankbait that goes 10 foot deep? You say, well, no, it's constantly grinding, it's constantly banging on the bottom. It's real hard to kind of, exactly. That's the exact reason why. It goes back to the tool. So years ago there for a while, what I started doing is I started carrying 3 rods with 3 different sizes of jigs on them. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody to do that right off the bat, because like I said, it's better if you take one size jig and fish with it for a little while. So a half ounce is good, but sometimes the water's shallow. So if your water, let's say, is 15 feet or deeper, you probably ought to use a half ounce jig, because when you throw it out, What you're trying to do is you're trying to catch fish that are on the very bottom, or they're out away from the banks. Another place that a 1/2 ounce jig works very well is clear water. Clear water, because you're getting the bait deeper quicker, so therefore you're getting more of a reaction bite with a 1/2 ounce jig, unless you're dragging it. But in the initial fall, what you're getting is you're getting that reaction. This, even though it has the same trailer as the other ones, this is going to fall extremely faster, being that it's a 1/2 ounce jig. Okay, now with it being a 1/2 ounce jig, most of the time it has a bigger hook. So with a 1/2 ounce jig, you're probably going to be better off using 20-pound line for the most part, because most of the time the hook size is relative to the size of the head of the jig, most of the time. So we've talked a little bit about a 1/2 ounce jig. Well, that should be all I ever need. Why would I need anything different? It goes back to using the tool. This jig here, 3/8 of an ounce. Not much different. It's the exact same color, exact same trailer. That's the only thing we're talking about here is the sizes, because you can still get bites by just changing the weight. Well, why would I want to do that? This is a 3/8 ounce jig versus a 1/2 ounce jig. Why would I want to throw this one? Well, it goes back to that, what we were talking about. So if you really want to start fishing a jig and you want to get better with the jig, then my suggestion is slow down the fall. Instead of changing your trailers, doing different things, pick up a couple of jigs that are 3/8 of an ounce and try to fish them in the same places that you would fish a 1/2 ounce jig. You're going to say, well, why in the world would I do that? I can just throw a 1/2 ounce and that's it. Well, what I learned was, if you're wanting to learn how to slow down with a jig, if you're wanting to learn how to take your time and fish a jig a little bit slower, use a 3/8 and throw it in the same places you throw a 1/2. Now, I'm not telling you to go in a windstorm and throw a 3/8. What I'm telling you is that when you're trying to slow yourself down, use this weight, go down to a 3/8 and throw it in the same places. Now my suggestion is to do it the same way, like I said before. Stick to this one until you learn to feel the weight of it. Why? Because this is going to, number one, it's going to fall slower. Number two, you're going to have to work the bait slower in order to keep this on the bottom. Bottom contact with a 1/2 ounce jig is pretty easy. You can shake, hop, whatever, it's going to go up, down, fairly quickly, okay? You're going to notice that when you use a 3/8 jig, you throw it out in the same place, same spot, you're going to throw it out. You're going to have to move more deliberate. You're going to have to give it more time in between each sink, because it's going to sink just a little bit slower. You're still going to get a fairly decent reaction, but you're going to fish it slower. This right here, honestly, you're going to fish it probably in water, I'm going to say 10 foot to probably 20 foot. That's where you're going to want to fish this 3/8. You can fish it as shallow as you want. Now remember, the 1/2 ounce, you can throw it in a foot of water if you want to. But if you have grass, if you have different things that you're throwing at, if you have big trees, things that way, you're going to notice that when you throw that 1/2 ounce in there, it's going to fall and you're going to get hung up a little bit more. It's not the weed guard, it's not, a lot of it has to do with the weight, because the weight keeps it pinned to the bottom. The 3/8 gives you just enough to where it sinks, but it gives you just a little bit of weight so that you can feel some of that stuff, but you have to going to be more deliberate in the way that you work the bait. In other words, you're going to have to slow down a little bit. You're going to have to more drag. Instead of with that one, you kind of hop it. This one, you're going to have to drag just a little bit more. So therefore, it's going to challenge you. It's also going to be a little bit harder to detect the bites, because this is a little bit lighter. And you wouldn't think it's that much different, but I have seen days to where that 1/2 ounce, you couldn't get a bite with it. And all of a sudden, I switched to this 3/8. And now, not only could I fish it more effectively through the cover and through the things that I'm fishing, but also I could turn around and they would grab it more. Why? Because it was the action they were looking for. Same trailer, same color. We haven't changed anything. All we've changed is the way that we're working that bait. What's this going to do? It's going to teach you how to become a better fisherman. It's going to teach you how to become a better jig fisherman, because there's going to be times, like I said, these are tools. Both of these are tools. You say, well, it's the same jig. No, it's not. This has a completely different action than this one does, okay? This is more of a reactive falling. This one tends to glide just a little bit more. This one forces me to slow down. So in temperatures like we're in right now, this is probably better for me to throw. On a day that there's a lot of wind, on the day that there's that I kind of figure, hey, they're biting today, this is probably the day I want to throw the half. On a day that I'm kind of not sure, maybe it's a bright sunny day, that's when I need to pull this 3/8 out. It's still a little bit windy, but not too much. We're not talking about 20-mile-an-hour winds. We're talking about a little breeze. This is probably the bait that I want to throw. Why? Because it still gives me a little bit of weight. I can still feel the contact on the bottom a little better, but this is probably more of the bait that I'm looking for, okay? If all of a sudden the wind picks up on the day and I can't feel this one, then that may be when I pick up my 1/2 ounce jig, okay? I just kind of have to tell. Like I said, years ago, I used to have 3 exact rods, all 3 of them set up with different sizes. Eventually, I learned and I taught myself when to throw each one, so now I can use 1 rod and just cut this one off and tie this one on. And I fish it for a little bit, and if I'm not getting the results I want, then I cut this one off and I tie this size on. That's just what I've done over the years. But originally, I had 3 different rods set up with 3 different rigs, exactly the same. And I learned that there were times and places for each one of them, because I fished exclusively a jig for several years, just because I went through that phase, okay? So you say, well, then a 3/8 is all I ever need, and I don't need any more sizes. That's all I need to do. Is now I just need to have 3/8, and I just throw it all the time. You could do that. You could do that, and you would be fairly successful, okay? You could just take just this setup right here, a black jig and a green pumpkin trailer, and throw it all the time, and you would be more successful than you realize, just because you fish this combination. But there's one other thing that we have left out, and that's the last jig that we're looking at. This is a 3/8, okay? This one here would be a 3/16 or smaller. You can tell this is a big change in the head from the first one. It's the exact same jig, exact same manufacturer, just a different size and weight. Same color, same trailer. Well, why in the world would I throw this right here? Well, like I was telling you, the gentleman that years ago taught me about jig fishing, this was one of his favorite things to use, was this smaller jig. And I learned over time that it became my favorite one at certain times of the year. Why? Because you would not believe how many bigger fish I've caught on this little jig right here. When do I throw it? Well, when most people would pick up a shaky head, when most people would probably pick up a drop shot, when a lot of people, now I'm not saying go fish this in 30 feet of water, it's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is a lot of people would pick up a finesse bait. What I'm telling you is that this becomes a little small finesse jig. Now this isn't the size of jig that most people would address as a finesse jig. You see me with a little brown one all the time. But this is what led me eventually to that finesse jig. This little smaller jig, even though it has a full skirt, has this bigger plastic chunk on here. When it falls extremely deliberate. Pretty easy still to cast. Now this one, I would probably, between the 3/8 and this one, I start leaning to about 15-pound line. Not quite as stiff as a rod as you usually hear your people throw your big jig on. This is where you would throw your medium heavy. You hear me talk about it, extra fast tip. This is what you fish this. Now that's the rod, and I'll make another video eventually about the rod that I use to fish jigs on here lately. One of my favorite rods that I've gotten. But this little jig right here falls even slower. Now I wouldn't fish this, like I said, in 20 foot of water, but I would fish this in certain situations that I would consider high pressured skies, you know, high bright blue days, a lake that gets pressured a lot, that maybe fish always see. Everybody in town goes and throws a 1/2 ounce jig. You go back to those same places and throw one of these, you might be surprised what kind of bite you would get. In temperatures that we're at right now, say water that is, you know, 50 degrees or less, early in the spring when they're up real shallow in 1-2 foot of water, be surprised how many big fish I've caught in water like that, fishing a jig, where everybody else has been throwing spinner baits or crankbaits or shaky heads or something else. You come back through with this little bitty jig and fish it in those same areas. You see logs, you see stuff, you pitch it over there and it sinks, and the way it slows deliberate, you'd be surprised how many bites you get. Now, going back to the same theory, you remember the reason why I said this jig here is easy to feel, because you can feel the weight. This one here, you don't always feel the bite. When you go to pick up, you teach yourself eventually, little by little, you get to this point. You talk about slowing down with a jig. Another thing that little 3/16 jig does, and even one a little bit smaller, if you go to a lake that has a lot of grass in it, you start throwing this 1/2 ounce jig around that grass, you're going to catch yourself a lot of times where it just goes in that grass and it just buries itself up. You pull up and you pretty much got a big handful of moss or handful of grass just wadded up on it, weigh about 3 pounds, it feels like sometimes. Now, you can go to this 3/8 ounce jig and you can throw it out and work it through some of that grass, and as long as you keep it working and kind of popping to you, it'll flow through the grass fairly well. But you're having to move it quick or keep it moving in order to come at you, okay? So in other words, you still have to give it constant movement. So it's almost, not quite, it's almost like a swimming a jig. You throw a jig out, put a different trailer on it, bring it back to you, and it's kind of like a spinner bait without the blades, okay? But you're having to move it fast. But that's not what I'm trying to do. When I'm going to this little jig, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to throw it over there next to where these are. And a lot of us know what it's like to throw a Senko, a little stick bait with just weightless. Throw it out and it kind of has that slow fall to it. You twitch it and it works and just things. This is very similar. But what you wind up doing is, where it has this skirt on it and where it has this bigger chunk on it, what it tends to do is it tends to move kind of like a bluegill through the water. If I'm letting it long enough get down to the bottom, sure, I can use it and kind of imitate a crawdad with it a lot of times, which is what we always associate a jig to. But this little smaller one, a lot of times, when you start working it and kind of popping it to you, and you're not having to work it as much, you give it time to get down in, and what it'll do is that weight will kind of go down into that grass, but because of the light weight, it won't dig into the grass, and it kind of lays on top of it, and then you can still pull it out. What does that do? This then becomes some type of little creature just kind of going through the water. A lot of times I think they think this right here is a more of a bluegill or something coming through, because the skirt will kind of pulse as you sit there and hop it. Now, over the years, I've learned a little technique that I can take that 1/2 ounce and I can kind of shake it on the way down, and I can slow the fall of it a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. I can do it even better with that 3/8, so I can pitch it out there, kind of let it, and in mid-fall, I can kind of shake it and hold it to me, but I have to constantly keep it coming to me to not let it get all the way down the bottom. Sometimes I don't want it all the way in the bottom. Sometimes I want it just swimming through the water column, but this little one does a lot of it on its own. It has more of a glide to it. Now, when you put it in the water, you're gonna say, man, that falls pretty quick. Well, put it in the water next to that 1/2 ounce, you'll see a big difference. Okay, so this is still gonna fall, but it's gonna fall just a little bit slower, and you'll be surprised how many bites you get on this little fella right here, especially when you're on a lake that, like I said, the water's probably 10 foot or less. This little bait right here can be very deadly. If you have somewhere that has a lot of bushes and a lot of things that, man, every time I throw that 1/2 ounce in, I'm getting hung up. A lot of that has to do with that quick drop that it has to it. You get hung up in the cover. As you start downsizing, you start realizing that this little fella right here, you can throw it in that same tree and it kind of glides. I can kind of hop it and bang it around some of those little trees and stuff, and they'll grab it. And where it doesn't have a lot of weight to it, they'll grab it sometimes and hold on longer than they win those bigger ones. But anyway, that's just one of the other little things about that little different size jig. Still a jig, but it's different sizes, different way of thinking about it. If you really want to learn how to creep a jig slowly, most people are going to say, just take that 1/2 ounce out there and work it, and you'll get used to fishing a jig slow. If you really want to fish a jig slow, you really want to teach yourself how to fish a jig slow, go to about 15 foot of water and throw this little 3/6 jig and keep it on the bottom. Then you're learning to fish a jig slow. Then you're learning to really drag a jig on the bottom. You could point your rod tip down, you can kind of pull it along like you would a football jig or a Carolina rig. You can do different things, but when you learn to fish a jig this size right here in 15 foot of water or more, then you're really going to learn, and you just might be surprised how many bites you get from this little fella right here. Now, talk a little bit more. Is it a clear water bait? Probably not. It's probably not the best thing to go take out to crystal clear water. You probably should take the 3/8, or you should probably take the 1/2. Can you? Sure. But if you have the slightest wind that day, this little 3/16 is going to be a challenge and a half to try to keep it on the bottom. I've even thrown this before on spinning rod and 10-pound line. I got my heart broken a couple times because I did that. But I've also caught some very nice fish on this little jig. My preferred is still 15-pound line on this little bait right here, and just let it sink slow. Let it do its thing. All three of these have its purpose. All three of these you can catch fish on, but each one of them has their own situations that it's best at. You're going to have guys that all they swear about is the little small jig. You're going to have guys that the only thing they fish is 3/8, and then you're going to have other guys that all they fish is the 1/2. And what I'm telling you is the guy that is really smart, the guy that really has truly learned how to fish a jig, you know what he does? What he does is he knows that these three are tools, and he keeps them all in his box, because there's different situations for each one of them. If you really want to elevate, push yourself a little bit fishing the jig, use the different sizes. I'm not telling you to go out and buy 100 of each one of them, but what I am telling you is that if you really want to become, you really want to learn a little bit more about jig fishing, about any fishing in general, challenge yourself just a little bit more. You know what? I catch a lot of fish on a 1/2. Man, I can't get a bite today, but man, I really like fishing that jig. Pick you up 2 or 3 3/8 jigs, and on days that you're having a hard time with a bite on a 1/2 ounce jig, pitch that 3/8 around a little bit. You just might be surprised. If you really want to challenge yourself, pick you up that little smaller one and say, you know what, I'm having a hard time getting a bite today. The water's kind of stained, it's a little muddier. I know, I got a feeling they're up shallow. Maybe this bait here, this 1/2 ounce one's just flying by them too fast. Maybe that's not what they want. Maybe they want something slower. Pick up that little smaller one, the little 3/16. You just might be surprised. You start pitching it in the same place, you'd be shocked. Be like, oh my goodness, and you'd be surprised with the size of the fish you catch. Anyway, this is just a little bit that come to mind. I wanted to talk a little bit about it because my goal really is to help people. My goal is really to kind of challenge you a little bit, like I've challenged myself over the years. Like I said, I've caught a lot of fish on all three of them. There's even other sizes in between these that we could go into more detail, but I just thought I'd make one about the 3 different sizes in general and how all 3 of them are good. All 3 of them have a different purpose. You know, if you go to a man that's really considered himself a handyman, and you go to him and you ask him, what's your favorite tool to use? You know what he's going to tell you? He said, man, I'm a handyman. I need all the tools in my box. That's really what I need. I have some that I use more than others, but I have a box full of tools, and they all have their purpose. It's the same thing with all these 3 sizes of jigs. It's the same thing with, if you want to come to my boat and you want to look at the baits that I have, I've got topwaters, I've got crankbaits, I've got deep crankbaits, I've got shallow crankbaits, I've got jerk baits, I've got jigs, I've got little shaky heads. I've got different things. Why? Because they're all tools. There's situations that come up that, you know, this jig here, I could turn around and say, hey, my favorite's 3/16, that's all I throw. Well, on those days that you got 10-mile-an-hour winds and the water's crystal clear and I can't get a bite, it's probably my own fault. Why? Because this is all I wanted to use. On those days, I should probably pick up a 3/8 or better. Or better yet, maybe if it's summertime, I need to take a 1/2-ounce jig and drag it around deep. A lot of times we don't grow because of our own selves, because we want to associate with a certain thing. If our goal is to go out and just try to catch fish, then what we need to do is we need to come out of our comfort zone a little bit. This is just advice. This is just, like I said, my life experiences that I've had, and our goal really should be, what do I need to do to catch fish? That's my little section of talk about the different sizes of jigs, and hopefully it made sense. Hopefully it helped you all a little bit. Hopefully it was explained a little bit to somebody who's just starting out and wondering what's the big deal about the different sizes. We're all blessed to go out. We're all blessed to have a good time. This is just a little idea of how we can do things a little bit different to maybe succeed at doing that. God bless you all, but above everything, remember, Jesus loves you all. Y'all have a great day.